Nero, who's in the last year of his reign, realizes that he has a huge problem with a major revolt of a major region of the Roman world in the Jewish area there. There's already instability here and there, and he wants to deal with these people ferociously. And so he summons the most competent military character in the Roman world at the time, a man by the name of Vespasian. And he tells Vespasian to go and put down that revolt in Judah. And so Vespasian musters an army of some 60,000 troops. These are not hired guns. These are the crack, highly disciplined military force, and it's 60,000. That is a huge, rather overwhelming force that Vespasian brings to the region of Israel at that time. He starts generally up in the region of Galilee and just systematically works his way down through, heading toward Jerusalem. Each little town, each little burg, each little village is crushed. It is a bloodbath. The descriptions that we have from Josephus are absolutely horrific. He talks about the Sea of Galilee. You could just see conspicuously as you looked out over it, bloated bodies that had been lampooned and speared and out there, and blood was in the streets of these villages and flowing down the Jordan River. Very, very comparable to the descriptions we hear of such things in the book of Revelation. And so this description that we have from Josephus indicates that this was not by any means a gentle move on the part of Vespasian. He was working his way relentlessly down toward Jerusalem. Thousands of Jewish people who were able to, ahead of Vespasian's attack, this kind of Sherman tank approach, fled for Jerusalem. So as the Christians were leaving, the Jewish people were heading to Jerusalem because they believed there they would be safe. Jerusalem was well provisioned to survive for several years under a siege condition, and that was the best option they seemed to have. And so thousands of them fled to Jerusalem, meaning Jerusalem became bloated and overpopulated virtually everybody in the Jewish world was fleeing there to find safe harbor in that city. Jerusalem itself, of course, when they arrived, they found was locked in civil war, because you had the moderates in Jerusalem who were saying, let's make peace with Rome. Let's, put up the white flag, we give, we're sorry kind of deal. But the prevailing power was vested more in these militant forces who wanted to continue to campaign. And so Jerusalem was locked in civil war, and it was also bloated and overpopulated. Virtually every Jewish person who could escape there was there at that time. Well, Vespasian was working his way toward Rome through this time from the year 67 to 68. But in the year 68, kind of halfway through, his campaign is interrupted by what's called the Year of Four Emperors. This was largely related to the meltdown that was taking place connected with Nero. And of course, Nero himself, as you recall, was forced to commit suicide. We saw that last week. And Vespasian, one of the major leaders in the Roman world, realized that this was a time when strong leadership was necessary, and he wasn't so sure the Jewish revolt was as important as securing things in Rome. But as it turns out, there were a series of rulers who tried to take over in Rome, and each one assumed the position of rule and then was cut short by the next one, and so it came to be called the Year of Four Emperors. The first of these was a guy named Galba, good-looking guy. He was old. This is really a good description of what he looked like toward the end, this image that you have here. He had been a well-known, highly respected military character. He was basically retired at this time. He was probably in his late 60s, 70s, pretty old for those standards in those days. But with the death of Nero, he realized somebody needed to step up, and there was a fair amount of support in the military for him to do so. So he went to Rome immediately and asserted himself as the successor to Nero, and was attempting to bring some degree of stability there in Rome. However, there was another character named Otho. Otho was formerly closely associated to Nero. In fact, there's strong support that they had been homosexual lovers. Otho had also had a wife that was taken by Nero and became one of the wives of Nero along the way. Otho was banished But Otho at the same time had always entertained the idea that he was really the one who should be the successor. And when Galba did not name Otho as the successor, Galba was old, they knew he wouldn't survive for too long, Otho got mad and gathered a force and attacked Rome. And Galba, as it turns out, was assassinated, and that put Otho on the throne for about 4 months, from January 15th to April 16th. A more credible successor, however, was a man by the name of Vitellius. He was a Roman military character up in the Germanic regions. His military strongly supported that he should go in and challenge Otho, which he did. There were a series of skirmishes. Vitellius came out on top. Otho committed suicide, and as a result of that, Vitellius became the next emperor, and he ruled from April down to about December. All this time, Vespasian, who has been involved in the Jewish wars, is gradually, carefully, methodically assembling what was going to be an overwhelming force, believing that this was a time when really Rome needed strong leadership with a strong military support. And so he arrives in December, challenging Vitellius, and indeed successfully defeats him. And so Vespasian, who has been responsible for the Jewish campaign, is now in December 22nd, the emperor, and he in fact rules for the next 10 years. It's called the Year of Four Emperors. What it should say to you is that Rome was convulsing. And it's interesting that Rome is convulsing just as Jerusalem is convulsing. And this is the culmination of several years of a growing kind of crisis politically in the Roman world. Tacitus himself frankly acknowledges that at the time he did not think Rome would survive. He thought this was the meltdown. He thought Rome was going to fragment, and that the great Roman world that had been there for 1,000 years was at this point simply going to fall apart. He had despaired as he was observing what was going on. Jesus said in the Olivet Discourse, "You'll hear of wars and rumors of wars." And believe me, that's exactly what was going on in the culture. There were wars, there were rumors of wars. It was a tumultuous and a time of upheaval, and it really culminated both in Jerusalem and in Rome with the kind of evidence that we see right here. All right, so Vespasian is the Roman emperor that actually brings a certain degree of stability back to Rome. However, of course, the problem in Judah still remained. He left care for dealing with the remaining revolt there, in Jerusalem especially, in the care of his son, whose name was Titus. I don't know, well, you can't see that hardly at all, sorry. But anyway, Titus is the son of Vespasian. Titus will eventually himself be a Roman emperor about 10 years later. So Vespasian leaves his son Titus there to mop up, as it were, the remainder of the problems in Jerusalem. The problem is that Vespasian took the best of his military forces with him back to Rome. And so it left Titus with a job, but not the same kind of quality military that his father had enjoyed. Titus was required to go out and hire a whole bunch of mercenaries. Mercenaries are not the most wonderful military force, you know. They're less dependable, they're less disciplined, they're in it for the money, they're not as reliable, and everybody knows that who's ever studied mercenary warfare. And so Titus didn't like that very much, but he didn't have much choice in the matter, and so he hires a bunch of mercenaries to carry out the rest of the campaign against the Jewish revolt, and so that's what's taking place. Having assembled this army, he lays siege to Jerusalem in April of 70. So Jerusalem is now for the second time under a complete siege. Of course, the city is heavily overpopulated. All of these people have come from the entire Jewish world in that region, and they're now holed up in Jerusalem. But even at that, they probably could have survived a siege for some years. Jerusalem was heavily provisioned to withstand siege warfare, and so there was at least some hope that they could hang on for a while and just see how this thing shook out. However, as it turns out, Jerusalem fell to Titus only 5 months later. The book of Revelation, you may recall, makes prominent mention of a 5-month period of time, presumably referring to this 5-month siege. The reason the siege didn't last longer is because the zealot forces in Jerusalem wanted to provoke violent response. They didn't want to sit in Jerusalem and simply wait for whatever was going to happen, so to force the issue, they burned all the food. And so what could have been reasonably comfortable circumstances for a protracted period of time became a crisis overnight. People went for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month, no food. And of course, what happens, as you know, when you have a concentrated population of people in famine conditions, this kind of artificial famine that's created in a siege, is things become unspeakably ghastly and ugly. And that is exactly what happened in Jerusalem, almost beyond description. With cannibalism, well-documented cases of parents eating their children, this kind of thing. I'm trying not to be too graphic, but it got so ugly that it almost defies description. Josephus gives us extensive recitation of it, and he was there. He was an eyewitness to the whole thing, writing it. He was a Jewish historian, but he happened to be on the Roman side, but he was right there, and he saw all the things that happened and gives us a remarkable description of it. Well, the catastrophe that befell Jerusalem finally led to the walls being breached in August, and of course the Romans broke in, and they found, of course, this horrific situation inside the walls of people just in a starvation condition and the most ghastly kinds of circumstances. And of course, the mercenaries that were there with Titus saw this as a huge opportunity for plunder. Roman disciplined soldiers would have been a little bit more guarded at this point, waiting for commands, but these mercenaries just went crazy. And so they were going through looting, burning, stealing, raping, pillaging, and everything you can imagine. And it actually got to the temple, and the temple itself was set on fire and was fully destroyed. And as Jesus graphically says in the Olivet Discourse, not one stone was left upon another. It will all be laid waste. Jesus also said, look, your house is left to you desolate. And this was when it happened. And so in a just remarkable, breathtaking fulfillment of what Jesus himself had predicted, these things took place. Titus was very upset that the temple in Jerusalem had been destroyed. He had wanted to preserve it. He believed that it was one of the most magnificent structures of the ancient world, which indeed it was, at least by every report. This was Herod's temple. Great expense had been expended, of course, to build this structure. He was very upset that it was destroyed, but there was not much he could do about it once the damage was done. He probably wanted to turn it into a great temple to the Roman gods, a pagan temple. That was his plan, and I think God in his providence was not going to permit such a thing to happen. And so the temple was destroyed. It was the end of the temple. The temple, of course, has never been rebuilt. In my opinion, never will be rebuilt, although I realize there's differing opinions on that in this room. But that was the moment, that was the paradigm-changing moment in history when, in fact, that Old Covenant era and the temple-centric worship was brought to its definitive conclusion, you see. If you have been to Rome, you've probably seen the Arch of Titus. This is the arch that was built for his triumph. This was the moment celebrating his defeat of Jerusalem. If you look closely at the design of it, you can see these are the artifacts clearly taken from the temple. The lampstand, of course, showing prominently there. The table of showbread, other artifacts that were recovered from the temple were taken back to Rome, and many of them melted down and so on. So this was really the moment that Titus celebrated. Tacitus tells us, however, that Titus did not view this as a great victory, and very interestingly and intriguingly, Titus himself felt that the catastrophe that befell Jerusalem was so horrific that it must have represented the very judgment of the Jewish God against those people. That's the way he viewed it. It was so much more horrific than even anything he could have anticipated or planned, that he himself took that view of it. And that's the Roman historian Tacitus telling that of Titus. So it's a very interesting little side note concerning him.